At midnight, on a date no one remembers, the world begins again. Every century, without warning, every city, every empire, every story, erased, not destroyed, not ruined, simply reset. The clocks keep ticking, but history does not. And somewhere, someone always finds out. And once you know, you can never unknow it. If you're watching this right now, take a second, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you do every day. Because if reality really did reset every 100 years, your job, your city, even your name might not exist in the next cycle. And now, let's begin. It began with a date that didn't make sense. Not a dramatic date, no war, no coronation, no catastrophe carved into textbooks. Just a small entry in an archive catalog, the kind historians scroll past 100 times a day. A municipal registry from a European port city, listing shipments, births, and property transfers from the late 19th century. Routine, forgettable, and until that moment, perfectly unremarkable. The historian almost skipped it. But there was a line, buried in the middle of the document, that snagged the mind like a loose thread on fabric. A warehouse listed as newly constructed on the exact same street with the exact same dimensions as another warehouse recorded as newly constructed 100 years earlier. Not rebuilt, not restored. Newly constructed. The same length, the same width, even the same architect's initials, though the name attached to those initials did not exist anywhere else in the record. It should have been a clerical error, a coincidence, the kind of thing you flag, correct, and forget. But the historian didn't forget, because 3 pages later, it happened again, and again. A row of buildings, each described as new, appearing at intervals exactly 100 years apart, down to the week. The materials changed slightly, the owners had different surnames, but the footprints were identical, the placement exact, as if the city itself were being traced over an invisible stencil. At first, the historian tried to disprove it. That's what training teaches you. Destroy your own theory before it embarrasses you. Cross-reference the records, check the maps, look for fires, floods, reconstructions that might explain the repetition. There were none. Worse, the maps contradicted each other in ways that couldn't be explained by error. Streets shifted subtly, angles changed by a degree or two. A chapel that should have faced east in one map faced northeast in another, precisely 100 years later, as though someone had tried to redraw the same world from memory and gotten a few lines wrong. It felt like looking at a copy of a copy of a copy. And the deeper the historian went, the more the patterns spread. Across different cities, different countries, different languages, markets that opened on the same dates a century apart, bridges built in the same locations with the same span, but with different materials and different builders who never referenced the earlier structure. Entire neighborhoods that seemed to reappear, century after century, like recurring dreams. Coincidence can explain a lot, but coincidence has limits. The historian began to track the intervals. Every 100 years, almost to the day, certain events, construction, migrations, economic booms, spiked in eerily similar ways. It wasn't exact, it wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to feel like a rhythm, a pulse, something repeating itself imperfectly, as if the world were remembering something it wasn't supposed to remember. At night, the historian stopped sleeping well. Not out of fear, not yet, out of anticipation, the sense that something was about to reveal itself if only you looked one layer deeper. The mind began to run ahead of the evidence, connecting points that shouldn't connect, drawing lines that shouldn't be drawn. That's when the dreams started. They were not dramatic dreams, no apocalyptic skies, no collapsing cities, just familiar places that felt slightly wrong. Streets that bent in ways they shouldn't, buildings that were almost, but not quite, the same as the ones in waking life. In the dream, the historian would walk through these places with a strange, sinking certainty. I've been here before, but not like this. And every time, just before waking, there would be a sound, a soft, distant click, like a clock resetting. The historian told no one about the dreams. Instead, they returned to the archives, because patterns in history are one thing, patterns in the mind are another, and the only way to tell the difference is to find evidence that exists outside of you. That evidence came in the form of a journal. It wasn't cataloged properly, it had been misfiled decades earlier, tucked between unrelated documents from a colonial administration. The cover was worn, the pages fragile, the handwriting uneven, like someone writing quickly, urgently, without the time or calm to make it legible. On the inside cover was a name that didn't match any known scholar, any known official, any known figure in the records of that region or period, which by itself meant nothing, until the historian read the first line. "I do not know how long I have before it happens again." The historian froze. It was the kind of sentence that can be read a dozen ways, a poetic exaggeration, a reference to illness, a metaphor for political upheaval. But there was something in the tone, plain, direct, almost clinical, that felt different. No flourish, no dramatics, just a statement. It took several minutes before the historian turned the page. The entries were dated, but not in a continuous sequence. Days would be missing, weeks skipped, and then suddenly the writer would return as if nothing had happened, continuing the same line of thought from the previous entry as though the gap in time had not existed. "I remember things I should not remember, places that are not here, people whose names no one recognizes, and yet I know with a certainty I cannot explain that I have walked these streets before, not in this life, in the last one." The historian's pulse quickened. There it was, the idea that had been forming, half-formed and unspoken, now written plainly by someone from another century. The last one. Another entry, several pages later. "The pattern repeats. I've checked the records as best I can. Every 100 years, there is a break, a seam in the fabric of events. After that seam, everything begins again, but not exactly as before. There are differences, small ones, but they accumulate." The handwriting grew more erratic in later entries, as if the writer's control over their own hand was slipping, or as if they were racing against something. "I have tried to tell others. They do not hear me, or they think me mad. Perhaps I am. But if I am mad, then why do the maps change? Why do the buildings reappear? Why do the dates align as they do?" The historian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the archive room. Because these were not vague mystical statements. They were observations, the same kind of observations the historian had been making, independently, a century later. Two people, separated by time, seeing the same impossible pattern. There are moments in research when you feel the ground shift beneath your understanding of the world. Not collapse, just shift. A quiet realignment of what you think is possible. This was one of those moments. The historian kept reading. "I believe," the writer continued in one of the final entries, "that we are not moving forward through time as we believe. We are moving in cycles, each cycle lasting 100 years. At the end of each cycle, something resets the world, not to its beginning, but to a state where we must begin again, unaware of what came before." A long pause in the text, several blank pages, as if the writer had stopped or been unable to continue. Then, one final entry. "If you are reading this, then the reset did not erase everything. Some things persist, some memories leak through. Perhaps writing is one of the ways to carry something across. If so, then I leave this as a warning. Do not assume that history is what you think it is. Look for the seams, look for the repetitions, and when you find them..." The sentence ended abruptly. No period, no continuation, just a trailing line as if the pen had been lifted in the middle of the thought and never returned to finish it. The historian sat back, the quiet of the archive suddenly heavy, as if the air itself were listening. There is a difference between discovering something unusual and discovering something that changes the rules of reality. The first invites curiosity, the second invites danger.
For the first time, the historian wondered, not academically but personally, what it would mean if this were true. If the world reset every 100 years, then everything the historian had ever studied, every narrative, every lineage, every carefully constructed timeline, was not a straight line stretching back into the past. It was a loop. And worse, if the reset was real, then it would happen again. In the future. In their lifetime. The historian looked at the date on the most recent documents they had been studying, looked at the pattern of intervals they had been tracking, and felt something cold settle in the chest. Because if the pattern held, if the intervals were as regular as they appeared, then the next reset was not centuries away. It was approaching, quietly, inevitably. And for the first time, the historian understood why the writer in the journal sounded so urgent, so afraid. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Every coincidence becomes suspicious, every repetition feels intentional. Every small glitch in memory, every moment of déjà vu, every detail that doesn't quite line up, suddenly feels like evidence. The world itself begins to feel unstable, like a story that has been told too many times, starting to fray at the edges. The historian closed the journal carefully, as if it might break, but the feeling did not close with it. It followed them out of the archive, out into the street, into the noise of the city, where people moved, talked, laughed, unaware that their lives might be part of a cycle they could not see, unaware that in some previous version of this world.
The first thing the historian did after the crossing, the moment that felt like a skipped heartbeat in the world, was return to the archives before the memory could fade or soften into doubt. Because doubt, they knew, is the mind's defense against impossible things. If you wait too long, the brain files it away as stress, as imagination, as a trick of light and sound. But this was not a trick. There had been a pause, a pressure, a sound that felt less like it was heard and more like it was registered, somewhere deeper than the ear. Click. The historian needed something external, something written, something recorded, to prove that the experience wasn't just internal, that it wasn't just them. The journal was the starting point, but one document, even a disturbing one, could be dismissed. What they needed was corroboration across sources that had no reason to agree with each other. So they widened the search. Different countries, different languages, different time periods that overlapped the intervals they had been tracking. They began looking for anything that felt discontinuous, any gap where history should have flowed smoothly, but instead seemed to skip. At first, it was subtle. In a set of maritime records from a northern trading port, shipping logs ran consistently for decades, then abruptly shifted in handwriting, terminology, even units of measurement. The officials responsible were listed as newly appointed, yet no records of their appointments existed. The previous officials simply stopped being mentioned, as though they had never held their posts. In a monastery archive, a chronicle of daily events, weather, harvest yields, births, deaths, was written in the same careful script for years. Then, one day, the ink changed, the style of writing shifted, the language simplified slightly, as if the writer had learned it from a slightly different tradition. The entries continued without acknowledging any break, as though nothing had happened. The date at the top of the page advanced by a single day, but the handwriting belonged to someone else, and that alone might have been explainable, if not for the patterns that emerged when these anomalies were placed side by side. They clustered. Around the same years, around the same decades, and when the historian mapped those clusters against the century intervals they had already begun to suspect, something emerged that was far more than coincidence. A gap, not a literal blank space where no records existed. History is never that clean. It was something more unsettling than that. A stretch of time where records did exist, but they felt shallow, incomplete, as if they had been written by people who did not fully understand the world they were describing. A century that was present in the timeline, but thin, like a layer of paint applied over something older that had been scraped away. The historian began to refer to it privately as the century that never was. It appeared in different forms across different cultures. In one region, it looked like a sudden cultural bloom, art styles appearing fully formed with no clear predecessors. In another, it appeared as a linguistic shift, languages changing faster than any natural evolution should allow, new dialects emerging without the usual transitional stages. In yet another, it showed up as genealogical confusion, family lines that seemed to begin abruptly with ancestors who had no recorded parents, no clear origins, as if entire populations had simply appeared. When studied in isolation, each anomaly could be explained, but together, aligned along the same 100-year boundaries, they formed something else, a pattern of interruption, a seam in time. The historians started constructing parallel timelines, layering records from different continents on top of each other, marking the points where continuity broke down. They expected the seams to be messy, inconsistent. Instead, they were precise. Too precise. In one case, two cities on opposite sides of the world, cities with no known contact at the time, both showed abrupt changes in architecture, administration, and population records within a window of less than 2 years of each other. The probability of that happening independently, without a shared cause, was so low that it barely registered as possible. Unless the cause was not local. Unless the cause was global. The historian felt the idea settle into place with a weight that made their hands tremble slightly over the documents. A reset would not leave the world empty. It would not wipe everything to nothing. It would restart. People would still exist, cities would still stand, but something fundamental, memory, continuity, the invisible thread that connects one day to the next, would be severed. And what came after would look, from the outside, like a natural progression, but would lack the depth of what came before. That would explain the thinness of the records, the suddenness of change, the sense that something had been overwritten. The historian leaned back, staring at the web of notes, maps, and timelines they had assembled across the table. If this was true, if there really was a century that was in some sense a reconstruction rather than a continuation, then it meant that every time the world reset, something of the previous cycle was lost. Not just events, understanding, knowledge, entire ways of thinking that might never be rediscovered in exactly the same way. A quiet extinction of memory, repeating every 100 years. The thought carried a strange, quiet grief with it. All the lives lived, all the discoveries made, all the stories told, reduced to faint echoes that might surface as myths, legends, or inexplicable coincidences in the next cycle. The historian found themselves thinking of the journal again, of the writer who claimed to remember. If memory could survive the reset, even partially, then those fragments might be what we call myth. Stories of great floods, fires, or divine resets that appear in nearly every culture on Earth. They are usually dismissed as symbolic, metaphorical, or coincidental. But what if they are not symbolic? What if they are actual recollections of actual resets, of actual endings and beginnings remembered imperfectly across cycles? The historian began to search for those myths, not as stories, but as data. They compiled accounts from different cultures, stories of the world being remade, of time starting over, of humanity being given another chance after a great erasure. The details varied, as stories always do, but the core pattern was consistent. A world exists. Something happens. The world is remade. People begin again, often with only a vague memory that something came before. When placed alongside the archival anomalies, the myths stopped looking like isolated cultural artifacts and started to look like echoes. Faint, imperfect, but persistent, as if memory itself were trying to push through the reset. But then another question emerged, one that made the historian's pulse quicken again for a different reason. If memory can leak through, why doesn't it leak through for everyone? Why are there only rare individuals, like the journal's writer, who seem to notice? Is it random? A quirk of biology? Or is it something else? Something that selects who remembers and who forgets? The historian didn't have an answer yet, but they had a direction. They began to look for individuals, people in the historical record who had been labeled strange, prophetic, or unstable, who had written or spoken about time in ways that didn't fit their era. People who described events before they happened, or who spoke of the past as if they had lived it twice. There were more than expected. Not many, but enough to form a pattern. A philosopher who wrote about previous versions of the world and was dismissed as delusional. A sailor who claimed to have visited a port that did not yet exist, describing its layout detailed decades before it was built. A woman who wrote letters describing a war that would not occur until years later, her descriptions matching events with uncomfortable accuracy. In each case, the person was isolated. Their accounts were not widely believed. Their writings often survived only in fragments, preserved by accident rather than by design. It is as if the world itself did not want those memories to spread, as if something was correcting the error. The historian felt a slow, creeping realization begin to take shape in their mind. If the reset is real, and if memory leakage is possible, then remembering is not just rare, it might be dangerous. Because if too many people remembered, if enough of humanity became aware of the cycle, then the reset might not work as intended. And if the reset serves a purpose, then anything that threatens that purpose might be removed. The thought was unsettling enough that the historian found themselves glancing, for the first time, over their shoulder in the quiet archives room. No one was there. Just the low hum of climate control, the faint rustle of old paper, the steady, ordinary world. And yet the feeling remained, that they were no longer entirely alone in their research, that by uncovering the pattern, by naming the seam, they had crossed an invisible line, from observer to participant. Because knowledge, once gained, has consequences. And if the century that never was real, if there really was a century that was in some sense a reconstruction rather than a continuation, then it meant that every time the world reset, something of the previous cycle was lost. Not just events, understanding, knowledge, entire ways of thinking that might never be rediscovered in exactly the same way. A quiet extinction of memory, repeating every 100 years. The thought carried a strange, quiet grief with it. All the lives lived, all the discoveries made, all the stories told, reduced to faint echoes that might surface as myths, legends, or inexplicable coincidences in the next cycle. The historian found themselves thinking of the journal again, of the writer who claimed to remember. If memory could survive the reset, even partially, then those fragments might be what we call myth. Stories of great floods, fires, or divine resets that appear in nearly every culture on Earth. They are usually dismissed as symbolic, metaphorical, or coincidental. But what if they are not symbolic? What if they are actual recollections of actual resets, of actual endings and beginnings remembered imperfectly across cycles? The historian began to search for those myths, not as stories, but as data. They compiled accounts from different cultures, stories of the world being remade, of time starting over, of humanity being given another chance after a great erasure. The details varied, as stories always do, but the core pattern was consistent. A world exists. Something happens. The world is remade. People begin again, often with only a vague memory that something came before. When placed alongside the archival anomalies, the myths stopped looking like isolated cultural artifacts and started to look like echoes. Faint, imperfect, but persistent, as if memory itself were trying to push through the reset. But then another question emerged, one that made the historian's pulse quicken again for a different reason. If memory can leak through, why doesn't it leak through for everyone? Why are there only rare individuals, like the journal's writer, who seem to notice?
Is it random? A quirk of biology? Or is it something else? Something that selects who remembers and who forgets? The historian didn't have an answer yet, but they had a direction. They began to look for individuals, people in the historical record who had been labeled strange, prophetic, or unstable, who had written or spoken about time in ways that didn't fit their era. People who described events before they happened, or who spoke of the past as if they had lived it twice. There were more than expected. Not many, but enough to form a pattern. A philosopher who wrote about previous versions of the world and was dismissed as delusional. A sailor who claimed to have visited a port that did not yet exist, describing its layout detailed decades before it was built. A woman who wrote letters describing a war that would not occur until years later, her descriptions matching events with uncomfortable accuracy. In each case, the person was isolated.
The historian expected to find anomalies in records. That was the nature of archives, small fractures in the surface of time. But they did not expect to find voices that felt like echoes. The search began quietly, almost cautiously, as if drawing too much attention to the idea might cause it to vanish. The historian refined their criteria, not looking for grand prophets or well-known figures. Those people were too visible, too documented. Instead, they searched for the marginal notes, the overlooked testimonies, the documents that had been dismissed as madness, misinterpretation, or superstition. And slowly, a pattern of people began to emerge. Different centuries, different continents, different languages, but the same message. The first voice came from a series of letters written by a minor civil servant in a provincial capital. His work had nothing to do with philosophy or prophecy. He recorded taxes, census data, shipments of grain. His life, on paper, was ordinary. Until the tone of his letters changed. In the middle of otherwise mundane reports, he began to insert lines that did not belong. "I have seen this market before," he wrote in one letter, "though the stalls are arranged differently this time." In another, "There is a child who lives on the corner of the Western Road. I know her face, though she was not yet born when I last walked here." His colleagues noted the shift. The responses in the margins, short, impatient, asked if he was ill, overworked, confused. He replied once, and only once, in a longer passage. "It is not confusion, it is repetition. There is a rhythm to this place that none of you can hear. I have heard it before, I hear it again now, and I fear that when it ends, you will all forget that it ever played." The letters ended shortly after. No record of his death, no dismissal notice, no explanation. Just silence. The historian felt a familiar tightening in the chest as they moved on to the next account. A ship's log, preserved by chance because the vessel had been lost at sea and the log recovered decades later. The captain's entries were methodical at first, weather, coordinates, crew health, but as the voyage continued, the entries shifted. "Strange sensation today," one entry read, "as if the ocean itself had paused. Wind dropped, waves flattened. Crew reported hearing a sound, could not place it, like a mechanism, distant." The historian's fingers paused on the page. A mechanism. A click. Later entries grew more unsettling. "We approached a port that does not exist on any map I have seen, yet I recognized it at once. The harbor shape, the breakwater, even the pattern of lights at night. I knew where to anchor before we saw the depth markers. I knew the tavern on the eastern dock before we stepped inside. I knew the face of a man who claimed we had never met." The final entry was brief. "If this is the second time, then I must remember more quickly in the third." The log ended there, recovered, catalogued, dismissed as the ramblings of a captain lost too long at sea. Another voice. A woman whose diary had been found in the walls of a house during renovations, its pages pressed flat and hidden for over a century.
Her entries were more emotional, less analytical, but the pattern was unmistakable. I dreamed of a city made of glass, taller than anything we have built. When I woke, I felt as though I had lived there for years. I knew the sound of its streets, the way the light fell between the towers. But when I told my husband, he laughed and said such a place could never exist.
Once the historian accepted that the pattern was real, that the cycle existed, that memory could leak through it, the next question arrived with an almost mechanical inevitability. What was doing this? Patterns do not enforce themselves. Rhythms do not sustain themselves for centuries across continents with that level of precision without something behind them, something that keeps the timing, that maintains the structure, that ensures the reset happens when it must. A mechanism. The word had appeared in the ship captain's log, an almost offhand description of the sound that accompanied the stillness. At the time, it had felt metaphorical, a poetic way to describe something that had no true language. But now, the historian began to wonder if it had been more literal than anyone realized. They returned to the sources, this time not looking for people or events, but for descriptions of systems. Anything that hinted at a structure underlying reality itself. Ancient models of time, early scientific theories, philosophical frameworks that described the universe as cyclical rather than linear. There were more than expected. In one manuscript, time was described not as a river, but as a wheel, turning, completing its revolution, then beginning again at the same point. In another, existence was framed as a sequence of ages, each ending in a renewal that erased the memory of the previous one. These ideas were usually interpreted symbolically or spiritually. But what if they weren't symbols? What if they were attempts, imperfect, incomplete, to describe a system that people had sensed but could not fully see? The historian began to look for something more concrete. They turned to architecture. If a mechanism existed, something that governed the reset of reality, then it might leave physical traces. Not obvious ones, not machines in the conventional sense, but patterns embedded in the way structures were built, aligned and placed within the world. They started with ancient sites, known for their precise alignments. Structures that had always puzzled historians and archaeologists because of their accuracy, their scale, or their apparent lack of practical purpose. At first, the alignments seemed to point to the sky, as they were often described, towards solstices, equinoxes, the positions of stars. But when the historian overlaid those alignments with the century intervals they had been tracking, something unexpected emerged. Some of the structures did not align with astronomical cycles. They aligned with temporal ones. Dates, intervals, points in time that repeated every 100 years. The historian felt a flicker of something like vertigo as the idea settled in. What if those structures were not just observing time, but marking it? Or even more unsettling, what if they were part of the system that controlled it? The thought would have sounded absurd only weeks earlier, but now, after the journal, the letters, the glitch in the crossing, it felt possible. The historian dug deeper. They began comparing the locations of these structures across the globe, mapping them not just geographically, but in relation to each other. Lines began to form, subtle at first, then more defined, connecting sites that had never been considered part of the same network. Lines that, when extended, intersected at points that corresponded to major historical resets in the pattern. It was as if the world itself had been overlaid with a grid, a framework, a structure designed to maintain the cycle. The historian stared at the map, a slow dawning realization taking hold. If this was real, if there was a grid, a mechanism embedded in the fabric of the world, then it had been there for a very long time. longer than any recorded civilization, which meant one of two things. Either humanity had built it in a past so distant that all memory of it had been erased, or it had been built by something else. The historian felt a chill at that second possibility, not because it implied something supernatural, but because it implied something external. A system imposed on reality, a cycle that was not just a natural phenomenon, but something maintained. The thought led to another question, sharper than the first. If the cycle is maintained, who maintains it? The historian turned next to science, modern theories of time, physics, cosmology, not because they expected clear answers, but because they hoped to find hints, edges of understanding where current knowledge brushed against something deeper. They found theories that described time as nonlinear, as something that could, under certain conditions, loop or fold back on itself. Models that suggested reality might be more like a simulation, capable of being reset, restarted, reinitialized. These ideas were controversial, speculative, but they existed, and when placed alongside the historical patterns, they took on a different weight. If reality were a kind of system, whether natural or constructed, then a reset every 100 years might be a kind of recalibration, a clearing of accumulated errors, a way to maintain stability. The historian thought back to the thinness of the records in the century that never was, the sense that something had been overwritten, simplified, reduced. What if that was the point? What if, as time progressed, small inconsistencies, instabilities, or deviations accumulated in the fabric of reality itself, and every 100 years the system reset to a baseline, preserving the physical world but clearing the memory of what had happened so that the next cycle could begin without the burden of the previous one's complexity? A terrifyingly elegant solution. A universe that corrects itself by erasing its own past. The historian felt the idea settle into place with a quiet, dreadful logic. It explained the precision. It explained the repetition. It explained why memory leakage was limited, allowed in small amounts, but never enough to disrupt the system as a whole, because too much memory would carry too much complexity forward, and complexity might be what the system was trying to control. But the more the historian understood, the more another question pressed forward, impossible to ignore. If this mechanism exists to maintain stability, why 100 years? Why that interval? Why not longer or shorter? Why allow a full century of development, of growth, of memory, only to erase it? The historian returned to the patterns. They compared the century interval to other cycles, astronomical, geological, biological. At first, nothing aligned. Then they noticed something subtle. Human lifespans. A century is, roughly, the maximum span of a human life. Not the average, but the upper limit. Long enough for one generation to live, create, build, and remember, but not long enough for more than a handful of individuals to span across the entire cycle. The implication was chilling. The cycle might be calibrated to humanity itself, designed around our capacity to remember, to pass down knowledge, to build continuity across generations. Every 100 years, just as the last living witnesses of the beginning of the cycle approach the end of their lives, the reset occurs, erasing the need for intergenerational memory, keeping humanity in a state where it can build but never accumulate too much, where it can discover but never fully remember. The historian felt a slow, dawning horror, because that meant the mechanism was not just a feature of the universe. It was tuned, optimized, for us. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the air heavier, because if the system was tuned to humanity, then humanity was not just a participant in the cycle, it was the subject of it, the thing being managed, the thing being controlled. The historian pushed back from the table, heart beating faster now, the intellectual curiosity giving way to something more visceral. Because understanding the mechanism was one thing, understanding its purpose was another. And the more the pieces aligned, the structures, the patterns, the memory leakage, the century interval, the more it felt as though the reset was not simply a neutral correction, it was a constraint, a limit placed on how far humanity could progress, how much it could remember, how much it could become. The historian's mind returned, unbidden, to the scattered accounts of those who remembered too much, the civil servant, the captain, the woman with the diary. All of them isolated, all of them unheard, all of them in some way cut off before their knowledge could spread widely. If the system was designed to prevent continuity of memory, then individuals who threatened that continuity might be anomalies to be corrected. The historian felt a cold clarity settle in. The mechanism behind reality was not just a passive system. It had safeguards, limits on how much could be carried across, limits on who could remember, and perhaps limits on what happened to those who tried to exceed those limits. The thought lingered, heavy, unavoidable. If the mechanism exists, if it resets the world every 100 years, if it is tuned to humanity, to memory, to continuity, then the next question was no longer abstract. It was immediate. Can it be stopped? Or, more dangerously, has anyone ever tried? The historian looked again at the map of alignments, the web of structures, the lines that seemed to connect the world into a single hidden framework. Somewhere in that framework, they felt, was the key, the control point, the place where the mechanism touched reality most directly. And if that place could be found, if it could be understood, then perhaps, just perhaps, the cycle could be broken. The idea flickered in the historian's mind, bright, dangerous, impossible to extinguish. But as it did, another thought followed, quieter, but far more unsettling. If the mechanism exists to maintain stability, if it resets the world every 100 years, if it is tuned to humanity, to memory, to continuity, then the next question was no longer abstract. It was immediate. Can it be stopped? Or, more dangerously, has anyone ever tried? The historian looked again at the map of alignments, the web of structures, the lines that seemed to connect the world into a single hidden framework. Somewhere in that framework, they felt, was the key, the control point, the place where the mechanism touched reality most directly. And if that place could be found, if it could be understood, then perhaps, just perhaps, the cycle could be broken. The idea flickered in the historian's mind, bright, dangerous, impossible to extinguish. But as it did, another thought followed, quieter, but far more unsettling. If a civilization in the past had already discovered this mechanism, if they had already tried to break it, and if the cycle still continues today, then what happened to them? The question hung in the air, unanswered. But somewhere, deep in the pattern of the past, the historian knew the answer was waiting for them, and finding it would lead them to the next chapter of the truth, a truth that would reveal not just the mechanism behind reality, but the cost of trying to change it.
The first clue did not look like a breakthrough. It looked like a mistake. The historian found it buried in a catalog of artifacts that had been misclassified decades earlier. Objects labeled as decorative fragments, their origins uncertain, their significance dismissed. They were thin plates of an unfamiliar material, neither stone nor metal, etched with patterns that did not resemble language at first glance. But when the historian tilted one under the archive light, the etched lines caught the glow in a way that suggested precision, angles too exact, spacing too consistent, like the markings of a system rather than decoration. A pattern. And when that pattern was overlaid onto the map of alignments, the grid of sites that seemed to structure the world, it matched. Not perfectly, but unmistakably. It was the first physical object the historian had seen that appeared to reference the mechanism itself. A civilization, long before the current cycle, had known. The historian's breath slowed, a strange mixture of awe and dread settling in. Because knowing was one thing, but the object suggested something more. It suggested intent. The plates were not isolated. There were more scattered across different collections, each misfiled, each dismissed as ornamental. When the historian tracked them down and placed their patterns side by side, they formed something larger, like fragments of a map that had been broken apart and hidden in plain sight. A map not of geography, but of the system. Lines converged on certain points, nodes where the alignments were strongest, where the subtle distortions in time the historian had begun to notice seemed to concentrate. At those nodes, the etched lines thickened, layered, almost like instructions. The historian felt the weight of the realization settle in. This was not just observation, it was a plan. The civilization that created these plates had not merely discovered the cycle, they had tried to change it. The historian traced the lines with their eyes, following them toward a central convergence point, a location that appeared again and again across the fragments, marked with a symbol that recurred in every piece. A circle, intersected by a line, split into two halves that did not quite align. The meaning of the symbol was not explained, but its placement suggested significance. A center, a fulcrum, the point where the mechanism could be influenced. The historians searched the records for any mention of a structure at that location, any trace of a civilization that might have built something there. The records were incomplete, not empty, not erased, but thin. The same thinness the historian had seen in the century that never was. But this thinness was deeper, older, as if whatever had existed there had been removed not just from memory, but from the very continuity of history. Yet fragments remained. A traveler's account describing ruins too precise to be ancient, yet older than any city we know. A fragment of a report from an early survey expedition, noting foundations of unknown origin arranged in a pattern that does not correspond to any known architectural style. And then, a single line in a document that had been almost entirely redacted, one of the few modern records that hinted at something deliberately concealed. Site exhibits temporal anomalies, further excavation not authorized. The historian read the line again, slowly. Not authorized. By whom? The thought flickered, but there was no answer in the document, only the implication that even in the present day there were places where the mechanism touched the world more directly and where knowledge of it was controlled. The historian leaned back, the pieces assembling in the mind. A civilization in a previous cycle had discovered the pattern. They had mapped it. They had identified the nodes, and they had built something, at least one structure, perhaps many, designed to interact with the mechanism, to break the cycle, to prevent the reset. The historian's gaze returned to the plates, to the etched lines that seemed almost alive under the light. If the plan had succeeded, the cycle would have ended. History would have continued. Memory would have accumulated across generations without being erased. We would remember everything. But the cycle had not ended. It was still here, which meant the plan had failed. The question was not whether the civilization had tried to break the cycle. The evidence now made that clear. The question was what happened when they did. The historians searched for any record of a sudden collapse, a catastrophic event that might correspond to the moment of failure. They found something. Not a single event, but a cluster of disruptions, scattered across regions, described in different ways. In one place there were accounts of the sky flickering, of daylight dimming and brightening in unnatural rhythms.
In another, there were reports of people experiencing simultaneous déjà vu so intense that entire crowds froze in place for several seconds.
In yet another, there were records of structures that seemed to shift. Buildings that stood one day and were gone the next, replaced by foundations that did not match what had been there before. None of these accounts were treated as connected. Each was explained away in its own context: natural phenomena, errors in observation, exaggerations. But the historians saw the pattern. They all occurred within the same narrow window of time, the same moment. The moment when the civilization's attempt to break the cycle must have reached its peak. The historian felt a tightening in the chest as the implications unfolded. If the mechanism was stable, if it maintained reality, then interfering with it would not simply stop the reset. It would destabilize the system itself. The world might not reset cleanly. It might fracture. The accounts of flickering light, of simultaneous pauses, of shifting structures, they sounded like the system struggling to maintain coherence, like a machine under stress. The historian's eyes moved to the final fragment among the plates, the one piece that did not fit neatly into the map, the one that seemed almost like an afterthought. On it, the etched lines were jagged, irregular, as if they had been carved in haste. At the center, the same symbol appeared, the circle, the dividing line, but this time the line was broken, and beneath it a series of marks that were not part of the original pattern. Not instructions, a message. The historian spent hours comparing the marks to known scripts, searching for any recognizable structure. Eventually, a pattern emerged. Not a direct translation, but a reconstruction of intent. A warning. The message, once interpreted, was chilling in its simplicity. We reached the center. We interrupted the sequence. For a moment, the cycle stopped. The world held its breath. The historian felt their own breath slow as they read. For a moment, the cycle stopped. They had done it. They had broken the mechanism, if only briefly. But the message continued. It was not stable. The system began to fail. Time fractured. Memory bled through in waves. We saw all cycles at once, past and future layered together. The historian's hands trembled slightly. All cycles at once, an impossible perception, a mind seeing not one timeline but all of them, overlapping, colliding. And then the final lines. We could not hold it. The system corrected. The reset was forced, stronger than before. A pause in the markings, like the writer had hesitated. If you find this, then you are in a later cycle. Do not repeat our mistake without understanding the cost. The historian leaned back slowly, the weight of the words settling in. The civilization had succeeded, briefly, in breaking the cycle. But the system had responded, corrected itself. And the reset that followed had not been a normal one. It had been stronger, more complete, erasing not just memory, but nearly all trace of that civilization's existence, reducing them to fragments, to misfiled artifacts, to a warning hidden in patterns no one had noticed until now. The historian's gaze drifted to the map, to the central convergence point marked again and again. The place where the civilization had made their stand, the place where the mechanism had been interrupted, the place where the world had, for a moment, held its breath, and then snapped back. The realization was both terrifying and clarifying. Breaking the cycle was not as simple as stopping a machine. It was altering the underlying structure of reality. And the system, whatever it was, had defenses.
It would not allow itself to be dismantled easily. The historian sat in silence, the hum of the archive filling the space between thoughts. The path forward was no longer theoretical. The mechanism existed. It could be interacted with. It could be disrupted. But doing so came with consequences that could ripple across the entire fabric of existence. The civilization that came before paid that cost. Their knowledge, their culture, their memory, almost entirely erased, reduced to warning that barely survived the reset. The historian closed their eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision that now hung in front of them. Because the cycle was still running. The next reset was still approaching, and now, for the first time, there was proof that it might be possible to stop it, or at least to try. The question was no longer whether the cycle could be broken. The question was whether it should be. And if the historian chose to follow the path of the civilization that came before, to seek the center, to interrupt the sequence, would they succeed where the others failed? Or would they trigger another correction, one that erased even more? The archive room was silent, the world outside continuing its ordinary rhythm. Unaware that in a quiet room, in the hands of one historian, lay the fragments of a plan that could either end the cycle or bring about its most violent reset yet. And somewhere, beneath the steady flow of time, the mechanism continued its count, ticking, toward the next century, toward the next reset, toward the moment when someone would have to decide whether to let the world begin again, or to risk everything to remember.
The historian stopped counting in decades. Decades felt too wide now, too forgiving. They smoothed over the urgency, stretched it thin until it almost felt distant again. The truth, once seen, refused to stay at a comfortable distance. So the historian counted in years, then months, then days. The pattern, once mapped, was precise enough to project forward. Not to the exact second, no model was that perfect, but close enough that the final window could be seen approaching like a storm line on the horizon, a boundary where everything that felt permanent would become provisional. The first change was internal. The historian began to notice the way their own mind treated time differently. Plans that once stretched comfortably into the future now felt fragile, almost hypothetical. Appointments, goals, even long-term research, everything carried an invisible asterisk, assuming the cycle holds. It was not panic, not yet. It was something quieter, more pervasive, a steady awareness that all of it, every building, every institution, every archive and memory and system of meaning existed inside a countdown that most people could not see. The city outside the archive windows continued as it always had. Traffic patterns repeated. Shops opened and closed. People argued, laughed, built, repaired, fell in love, made plans for years that the historian now knew might never fully exist. There was a strange tenderness in watching it, because none of it was meaningless, but all of it was temporary. The historian returned to the plates, the maps, the warning from the civilization that had come before. Do not repeat our mistake without understanding the cost. That line settled into the historian's thoughts, returning again and again in quiet moments. Understanding the cost meant more than intellectual comprehension. It meant imagining the lived reality of a failed attempt, the instability, the fracture, the moment when time itself had struggled to hold together. The historian had felt a hint of that during the crossing, the brief stillness, the click. Multiply that by the entire world, by every place, every person, every structure existing at once. The cost was not abstract, it was catastrophic. And yet, allowing the cycle to continue meant something else.
It meant consenting to a system that erased memory every 100 years, a system that prevented humanity from accumulating its full history, from learning from its mistakes across centuries, from building a continuity that extended beyond a single lifespan. It meant accepting that everything being built now, every idea, every discovery, every story, would dissolve into fragments and myths, leaving only faint traces for the next cycle to rediscover. The historian felt the tension between those two realities grow sharper with each passing day. Break the cycle and risk destabilizing reality. Allow the cycle and accept a perpetual forgetting. There was no path without cost. So the historian began to ask a different question. If the cycle could not be safely broken, could it be worked with? The idea was not as dramatic as shattering the mechanism. It did not promise a sudden, permanent end to the resets, but it suggested something else, something that might be achievable within the system's limits: preparation. If memory could leak through, even in fragments, then those fragments could be shaped, guided, amplified. The historian returned to the accounts of those who remembered: the civil servant, the captain, the woman with the diary. Their memories had surfaced spontaneously, unstructured, often confusing even to themselves. But what if memory could be made more clear, more deliberate? The historian began to consider the ways information persists even when explicit memory fails: symbols, architecture, art, stories, patterns that embed themselves in culture so deeply that they are repeated, even when their original meaning is forgotten. What if those forms could be used to carry knowledge across the reset? Not in the form of direct instructions; those might be too obvious, too easily erased or corrected by the mechanism's safeguards, but in the form of patterns that would re-emerge naturally in the next cycle. A symbol that appears in multiple cultures carrying a hidden structure, a story that encodes a sequence of ideas beneath its surface narrative, a building alignment that subtly marks the grid, guiding future observers to rediscover the system more quickly. The historian felt a quiet sense of purpose begin to replace the earlier dread. If the cycle could not be stopped cleanly, then the goal might not be to stop it. It might be to outlast it, to build a continuity that did not rely on a single timeline, to create a chain of memory that spanned resets, not through individual minds alone, but through the structures of culture itself. The historian began to design. Not machines like the previous civilization had built; that path had already shown its risks, but networks of meaning. They studied existing symbols that had persisted across centuries, even millennia. Simple shapes, recurring motifs, geometric patterns that appeared in different cultures with no obvious connection. Some of those patterns, the historian realized, already resembled fragments of the map etched on the plates.
Was that a coincidence? Or were those symbols themselves remnants of earlier attempts, echoes of past cycles that had tried, in their own way, to leave messages forward? The thought carried a strange sense of companionship across time. The historian was not alone. Others had tried before. Others had left traces. And those traces had survived, in altered forms, in the stories and symbols people still used today. The task, then, was not to start from nothing. It was to continue a process that had been happening, quietly, across cycles. The historian began to place markers. Small at first, subtle. A pattern embedded in a public artwork, a series of lines in a design that, to most observers, would look purely aesthetic, but that encoded the alignment grid when interpreted correctly. A story published under a different name, framed as fiction but carrying within it the structure of the cycle, the intervals, the nodes, the warning. A set of coordinates hidden in a sequence of seemingly unrelated numbers in an academic paper, pointing toward one of the convergence points. Each act was small, almost invisible, but together they formed a network, a seed, something that might survive the reset, not as a single clear message, but as a set of clues that, when reassembled by someone in the next cycle, could accelerate their understanding, could help them remember sooner. The historian found themselves thinking often of the line from the captain's log. If this is the second time, then I must remember more quickly in the third. That, perhaps, was the key, not to stop the cycle in one attempt, but to reduce the time it took in each cycle for someone to rediscover the truth, to compress the learning curve, to ensure that the knowledge of the mechanism, of the reset, of the risks and the possibilities surfaced earlier and earlier in each new century. Eventually, if the chain held long enough, humanity might reach a point where the cycle was understood so early, so clearly, that a safer method of interacting with the mechanism could be developed, a way to change it without destabilizing everything. But that would require continuity, patience, and a willingness to act knowing that the results might not be seen within one lifetime. The historian felt a quiet shift inside themselves. The fear had not vanished, the knowledge of the approaching reset still pressed at the edges of every day, but alongside it now was something else. Purpose, a sense that even within a system designed to erase, it was still possible to build something that endured. The historian looked out over the city again, the late light catching on glass and stone, people moving through their ordinary lives. They would not know, not this time, but perhaps in the next cycle, someone would walk these same streets and feel that strange pull, the sense that they had been here before, that something about the world was familiar in a way they could not explain. Perhaps they would find one of the symbols, read one of the stories, notice one of the alignments. Perhaps they would begin their search earlier, find the plates sooner, understand the mechanism more quickly, and perhaps with each cycle, that moment of realization would come closer to the beginning, until one day someone would understand the system well enough, early enough to change it safely. The historian returned to the archive table, to the plates, to the map, to the warning. The final years were no longer just a countdown. They were a window, a limited span of time in which to plant as many seeds as possible, to hide as many fragments as possible, to prepare the next cycle. Because when the reset came, and it would, the world would not end. It would begin again, and somewhere in that new beginning, someone would find the traces left behind. Someone would remember, and the chain would continue. The historian picked up a pen and began to write, not a report, not a paper, but a message, carefully constructed, layered, encoded, not meant for the present, meant for the future that would begin when this one ended, a message for someone who had not been born yet, or perhaps had been born many times before. The pen moved steadily across the page. Outside, the world continued, unaware of the countdown, unaware of the hidden network forming beneath its surface. And somewhere beneath the steady flow of time, the mechanism continued its silent rhythm, ticking, closer, closer, to the moment when everything would pause and begin again. The first sign is not a flash. It's the absence of one. No sunrise, no gradual shift of shadow across the wall. The sky simply holds its breath, suspended between night and morning as if something behind the curtain has forgotten its cue. Clocks still tick, but their rhythm begins to sound hollow, like a metronome in an empty room. Somewhere, a dog barks once, and then not again. The air feels thinner, not in oxygen, but in meaning. The last day has begun. You wake before dawn, though dawn never quite arrives. Your body has learned this day by heart, even if your mind cannot name it yet. There is a pressure beneath your ribs, familiar, anticipatory, the same pressure you felt in dreams that never made sense until now. The calendar reads the final date of the century, but the date has always been wrong. Outside your window, the city moves with a strange kind of urgency. Not panic, people don't know enough to panic, but something like restlessness. Commuters walk faster without knowing why. Conversations are clipped. There is an unease in the air that no one can quite locate, like the distant hum of a machine you can't see but can feel in your bones.
You dress quickly. There are things you have to do before the reset comes, things that must be tried, even if they have never worked before. You step into the street, and immediately you notice it. The first true glitch. A man walking past you flickers, not visually, not in a way you can point at, but in presence. One moment he is fully there, weight and sound and breath, and the next he feels thinner, as if he has been slightly erased and then redrawn a fraction of a second later. He doesn't notice. He keeps walking, but your chest tightens. It has begun early this time. The world is losing coherence. You head toward the rendezvous point, where the others who remember have agreed to meet. The building is old, older than most of the city's visible history, though you suspect it has been rebuilt countless times under different names. The doorway creaks as you push it open, the sound stretching slightly too long, like an echo that doesn't want to end. Inside, they're already there. A dozen faces, some familiar, some new, all carrying the same weight in their eyes. They look at you, and you know they feel it too, that tremor beneath reality's surface, like ice cracking underfoot. No one says hello. There's no need for greetings on the last day. "We're earlier than last time," someone murmurs. Her voice wavers slightly, like it's traveling through water. "Not earlier," another replies quietly. "Closer. Closer to the point where the system can no longer hide the seams." You spread the documents across the table, the fragments of knowledge gathered across lifetimes, maps of places that no longer exist but will exist again, notes about locations where the resets seem to ripple outward, theories about the mechanism, whether it's a machine, a natural cycle, or something older than either. Today, you test the final idea, not to stop the reset, but to witness it fully, to stand at the center of it and remember. Outside, the sky flickers. For a moment, just a moment, the clouds moved backward. The shadows of birds reverse their flight across the pavement, then snap forward again as if corrected. A car engine stalls mid-rev, then resumes without the driver realizing anything happened. Time is no longer flowing smoothly. It is stuttering. The first real fractures have appeared. You all feel it in your bodies, a pressure in the ears, a metallic taste on the tongue, the sensation that your memories are shifting slightly out of alignment, like books sliding on the shelf. Names become harder to hold on to. The faces of loved ones blur at the edges. The reset is not a single moment. It is a collapse, and you are inside it. You leave the building together. There is no point in hiding anymore. If the world is going to end and begin again, you want to see it from the open sky. The streets are growing stranger by the minute. A woman stops in the middle of the road, looking around in confusion. "Was I just here?" she asks no one in particular. A child drops his toy, and when he bends to pick it up, it is not the same toy. Similar, but slightly different in color and shape, as if the world's assets are being swapped out in real time. The glitch is spreading. You walk toward the highest point you can reach, the old tower overlooking the river. It has stood through many versions of the city. It will stand again. It always does, though its name changes and its stones are replaced century after century. As you climb the steps, the sound of your own footsteps begins to echo ahead of you, arriving before you step. Cause and effect are unraveling. At the top, the view is wrong. The river below flickers between different widths, as if remembering multiple versions of its own past course. Buildings along the horizon appear, vanish, and reappear in slightly different configurations. For a brief, breathtaking second, you see a skyline that does not belong to this era. Towers of glass and steel that have not been built yet, or have already been erased. Even your thoughts freeze for a fraction of a second, suspended in a perfect, terrifying stillness. This is the exact instant of reset. You feel it as a release, as if a tension you didn't know you were holding suddenly snaps. The world does not explode, it exhales. Light floods everything, not from the sun, not from any direction you can locate, but from everywhere at once.
The layered centuries collapse inward, folding into a single point. The sound, the low, bone-deep hum, rises to a peak that you feel will shatter you from the inside. You try to hold on to something, anything, a memory, a name, a face, but they begin to slip. The tower beneath your hands dissolves into brightness. The river, the city, the sky, all of it unravels into the same blinding, formless light. You are losing your place in time. This is what every human being experiences, though they will never know it. A perfect erasure. But you are different. You have prepared for this. As the light intensifies, you focus on a single thought, the one you have carried across lifetimes, the one that has always slipped away at the last second. Remember. The word echoes in your mind as everything else falls apart. You pour every ounce of your will into that single command, as if you can carve it into whatever comes next. Remember. The light reaches its peak and then collapses. Darkness. Silence. And somewhere, far away, the first sound of a new century beginning.
Darkness is never truly empty. At first, it feels like it is. No light, no sound, no sense of body or place. Just a quiet so complete it almost has weight. But then, slowly, something begins to move inside it. Not outside you, inside you. A flicker, a trace, a shape that isn't quite a memory and isn't quite a thought. A word. Remember. It arrives like a ripple across still water, spreading through a mind that does not yet know what it is. There is no language here yet, no identity, no history, only a presence becoming aware of itself in the aftermath of erasure. And yet the word remains. Remember. Time begins again, not with a bang, but with a whisper. The first sensation is warmth. Soft, diffuse, unfamiliar. Then comes gravity, pulling something that feels like a body into shape. Then sound, a distant murmur like voices heard through a wall, slowly resolving into the rhythm of a new world forming around you. You open your eyes, but you do not know that they are your eyes. You are lying somewhere. The surface beneath you is firm, but strange. Above you, a ceiling you do not recognize. The air smells faintly of dust and sunlight. Somewhere nearby, someone is speaking, but the words have no meaning yet. They are just patterns of sound sliding past your mind without attaching to anything. And still, beneath it all, remember. The world around you sharpens by degrees. Shapes become objects. Sounds become language. You sit up slowly, your body responding with an instinct it learned in another lifetime. There is a room. There are walls. There is a window. Outside the window, a new century has begun. The sky is clear, innocent. The buildings are familiar in the way all things are familiar when you have no reference for what they used to be. People move through the street below with the quiet confidence of those who believe they are living in a continuous history. None of them know. None of them can know. But you feel it. Not as a memory, those have been wiped clean, but as a pressure behind your thoughts. A sense that something has been left behind for you. Something just out of reach, like a word on the tip of your tongue. You stand and move toward the window. Your reflection in the glass is not the face you remember, because you remember no face. It is new, as everything is new. And yet, as you look into your own eyes, there is a flicker of recognition that makes no sense, a familiarity without a source, as if someone else has looked out through these eyes before. The day unfolds around you in simple, ordinary motions. You are given a name. You are told where you are. You are folded gently into the fabric of a life that feels like it has always been waiting for you. But the feeling does not go away. Remember. It surfaces in quiet moments, when you are alone, when you stare too long at the horizon, when the wind moves through the streets in a certain way that makes your chest tighten for reasons you cannot explain. Days pass. Weeks. The world settles into its new rhythm. History begins to write itself again from the beginning of this century, layering events, stories, and identities over the blank slate left by the reset. But you begin to notice things, small things at first. A building that feels older than it should be, a street corner that gives you a sense of déjà vu so strong it almost makes you dizzy, a tower in the distance that draws your attention again and again, though you do not know why. You find yourself drawn to it one afternoon, following an instinct that feels older than your life. The path to it is easy to find, as if your feet already know the way. The closer you get, the stronger the pressure in your mind becomes. Not pain, more like a resonance, as if something inside you is being tuned to match something outside.
The tower stands above the river. You stop at its base. Your heart begins to race. You have never been here. And yet, you have. The thought hits you like a shock, and with it comes the first real crack in the wall that the reset built inside your mind. A flash, too quick to fully grasp, of standing here before, of a sky that flickered, of a silence that swallowed the world. You stagger slightly, gripping the stone. Are you okay? The voice startles you. You turn to see someone standing a few steps away, watching you with the same strange intensity that you now realize is reflected in your own eyes. They know. Not consciously, not in a way they could explain, but they feel it too. Do you ever... You begin, and then stop, because you don't have the words for what you're trying to ask. They finish it for you. Feel like you've been here before? The air between you shifts. A connection forms. Two minds, both carrying the same impossible echo. You nod slowly. Yes. Silence stretches for a moment, heavy with unspoken understanding. Come with me, they say quietly. You follow them up the tower steps. Each footfall feels like it is landing in the same place it has landed before, in another life, in another century. The echoes of your steps are almost, but not quite, out of sync, like a memory trying to catch up with the present. At the top, the view opens before you. The river, the city, the sky. Everything is stable now, perfectly aligned in this new cycle. There are no flickers, no fractures, just a world at the beginning of its 100-year arc, confident in its continuity. But you feel what lies beneath it. You feel the mechanism sleeping, waiting. Your companion steps to the railing and places a hand on it, exactly where you once did, though neither of you can fully recall that moment.
I keep having dreams, they say, about light, and a sound I can feel in my bones, and a word that I can't forget, even when I wake up. Your breath catches. Remember, you whisper. Their eyes widen. That's it. The word hangs in the air between you, no longer just a private echo in your own mind. It has been spoken out loud. It has been shared. And in that moment, something changes. It is subtle, but you feel it. The act of speaking the word, of passing it from one mind to another, gives it weight, anchors it, makes it harder for the system to erase completely next time. A message carried forward not in ink or stone, but in consciousness. You are not the only ones. As the days turn into months, you begin to find others, drawn to the same places, haunted by the same half-formed dreams, carrying the same unexplainable sense that the world is not as continuous as it appears. A small group forms, then a larger one. You share stories that sound like fragments of a forgotten language. You compare the flashes of memory that surface at the edges of sleep. You map the locations that feel older than the rest of the world. The tower becomes your meeting place, a constant in a resetting world. And slowly, carefully, you begin to do what those before you tried to do. You begin to leave messages. Not obvious ones. The system would erase those. You have learned, though you cannot say how, that anything too direct, too explicit, will be smoothed over by the reset. Instead, you hide them in places the mechanism does not fully control. In patterns, in stories, in symbols that look like art, but carry meaning for those who know how to look. You carve small marks into the underside of the railing where no one else would think to look. You encode phrases into books that will be reprinted again and again. You design buildings with subtle asymmetries that will feel wrong to the next version of you, just enough to trigger the question, why does this feel familiar? And always at the center of it, the same core message, remember. Years pass. The new century grows around you, rich and complex and full of lives that will never know they are part of a repeating pattern. Empires will rise. Technologies will change. People will fall in love, have children, build futures they believe will stretch endlessly forward. And you will live among them, carrying the knowledge you can never fully prove. But the message spreads, quietly, patiently, from mind to mind, from generation to generation, passed not as a fact, but as a feeling, a question that cannot be silenced. What if this has all happened before? On the 100th year, the sky will hold its breath again. The wind will stop. The world will forget itself. And once more, everything will be erased, but not completely. Because somewhere, in the darkness that follows, a mind will awaken with a word already waiting inside it. A word you placed there. A word you were always meant to find. Remember. And maybe, just maybe, 1 century, one version of you will remember enough to see the mechanism before it engages, enough to understand it, enough to break it, or to choose, finally, whether it should ever be broken at all. Because the greatest mystery was never why the world resets. It was why, after every erasure, something in you refuses to let the story end. And now, as you stand on the tower in a world that believes it is new, you feel the quiet weight of that truth settling into place. The message was never hidden in the world. It was hidden in you, waiting for the moment you were ready to hear it.